So yeah, my first question will be, what do you think on the diagnostics and the treatment for minorities in terms of psychotherapy?
So let's clarify first of all what the real question is. In other words, diagnosis and so on is used not only for psychotherapy, it's used, in fact, primarily in terms of DSM and ICD for psychopharmacology. The whole rationale for the DSM came out of a concern for differential diagnosis, the US-UK project on psychosis, trying to distinguish schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So many of the entities there are oriented much more toward thinking about differential pharmacotherapeutics. Yeah. And as you know, in terms of psychotherapy, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or psychodynamic therapy or family therapy, many of the different approaches have broad applicability and are generally approach patients less in terms of diagnostic categories and more in terms of symptoms and problems that people have, so something like a cognitive strategy of reattribution, let's say, applies to anything where you think, well, the attributions a person is making is part of the problem that they're having, so we can focus on that. Mm-hmm. And that fits with other diagnostic approaches like high top and other things where people are trying to say, let's have a transdiagnostic approach. We have a transdiagnostic treatment, so let's have a transdiagnostic evaluation process that will list the kinds of symptoms or problems or targets that our treatment approach, our psychotherapy approach, whatever we think focuses on. So maybe before I go on, say a little bit more, since we can edit all this, say a little bit more about where you're coming from with that question and what the puzzles are. I haven't said anything yet about minorities. Everything I said is very general, really applies to everybody. Yeah. So what in terms of minorities, what's the issue around diagnosis and psychotherapy in Netherlands, let's say?
Exactly. So here we have a different current. Then you work with indigenous cultures. Correct me if I'm wrong. And here we work in the Netherlands more with Turkish or Arabic communities. They are from.
No, we work. I mean, I don't work mainly with indigenous population because more than half that population lives in small, remote areas. So the hospital I work at, 65% of the people were born outside the country. So we work with high levels of migrants from different places. Some of whom do not have good English or French, some of whom have very different value systems, different family configurations, different ways of interpreting illness. So, there are challenges in terms of both framing the problem in a way that makes sense to them, and not inadvertently conveying a lot of stigma, let's say, because for most people, for most parts of the world, psychiatry as such is associated with the most severe problems. So if you say, oh, you need to see a psychiatrist, it's like, oh no, or you're saying I'm crazy, you're saying I'm a mad person, that this is a catastrophe, If we say, oh, no, we do that, a person's having trouble in their deciding on their career or in their marriage, or just they've lost their zest for life, we say, oh, go talk to a psychiatrist, maybe you're depressed or maybe you just need some psychotherapy and you'll make sense of that. So we have this huge broad spectrum that we want to include within the same mental health care system, but that's not the way most people who are coming from other places that don't have the same numbers of psychiatrists, don't have the same sort of tradition of these institutions. So we have a big issue right away. Even when we refer people from the emergency room, we have a separate building at our hospital, the Institute of Community and Family Psychiatry. So the name's right on the outside. It's got community and family. That's nice. But psychiatry is like, oh, why am I being sent to this building? This is not in the main hospital. This is beside, even that is an interesting story about the hospital and why, how things get configured. Yeah. So there are dilemmas around that, first of all, just in terms of how we frame the nature of the problem and the appropriate form of help. Mm-hmm. I guess people become familiar once they come for treatment. They begin to see, oh, wait a minute, we're talking about everyday life things. I'm not being stigmatized. I'm not being pathologized. Mm-hmm. You can have a more reassuring and trusting and relationship with a psychiatrist or therapist that that listens to you and that offers the stuff. So then I think at that point you get into deeper problems, which is fine. Okay, I trust this person, that they're trying to help me. I can tell them things that I maybe can't tell my partner or other people in the community because they're shameful or embarrassing or will lead to stigmatization. So that's nice to have that confidant. The dilemma then becomes, how are they suggesting I approach this? And this is where psychotherapies become, somewhat challenging, in the sense that there might be general strategies that are very broadly applicable, but there may be specific ways of approaching things and framing things that are more problematic for people. Right. So, in North America, where we have what Robert Bell has called expressive individualism, where, to be a good person is to be able to say, this is what I think, this is what I feel, I'll put myself out there and I'll be open and I'll be assertive, and these are all good things. That's not the case in many, many cultures.
It's not.
So then those basic values that we even view as a kind of mark of health and of psychological strength are actually, in other contexts, a sign of being inappropriately socialized, like not responding to the cues. So like if you try to act that way, people look at you and say, this person is overbearing, this person is insensitive somehow.
Yeah, exactly. This is the I and we culture, which is a very strong contrast. In the Netherlands, I feel that in my first year of residency, I was sitting in a group of people and I was telling that in Turkey, it's normal if a 40-year-old man lives with his parents, taking care of them. This is totally. And then one of the residents turned to me and said that, well, here we call them sick. And I swallowed it. And it still is kind of pain in my heart that it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's pathologized, like that's dependent personality disorder, or in folk psychology in North America, that's codependence, because mother and child are both getting something out of this. And it's all looked at with great suspicion, because there is a very particular model. It's even more true in the United States than it is in Canada, that when you reach the age of 17 or 18, you go away to school. And this is a very important developmental step. This is your emancipation. Even if your parents are paying for you to stay in a residence at university, you're like becoming your own person. You're becoming an adult, and maybe you just come home for Thanksgiving dinner, kind of, and then you go back. And that's if you don't do that, that's what's called a failure to launch. Like you have not made it to the next step. And not coincidentally, that coincides neurodevelopmentally with the peak period for people to develop onset of psychosis. So you can say, look, there's a huge developmental demand in those societies. And at the same time, this is also a point of vulnerability in terms of whatever the underlying processes are that lead to that kind of psychosis.
Yeah, exactly. Today, Kemal was giving a lecture, and he said that one of his teachers in McGill actually told him that don't take two things from the West. One is individualism, and the second is borderline personality disorder, because it's not applicable to the Eastern cultures. Do you have any experience in there?
Well, so the individualism we've been talking about a little bit, and some of the dilemmas with that. And I should say that whenever we do that, it's important not to make it too extreme, because of course, even in the most collectivist, family-oriented culture, people have individual experiences and perspectives. People are burdened by things. They're frustrated by things. They push back against things. Being told, "Oh, you're the oldest son, you must do so and so," or "You're a woman, you must do so and so." Even in people who accept those values, still have internal conflicts about that, and may benefit from somebody who gives a sympathetic hearing to what they're struggling with, without taking to oversimple, one side or the other in an oversimple way. So anyway, we can talk more about that, about the kind of individualism, and even recognizing, we should say, they're individualisms, because it looks a little bit different in Canada than it does in the US. It looks there's a guy called Sampson who's written what he calls, a psychologist called ensembled individualism. Because for many people, even in very individualistic societies, they still have a sense of what's the inner circle, what's the outer circle, and they're still identified with those inner circles. So it's never absolute, and I think that's important. Similarly, when you see the collectivist society, if let's say you're coming as a Dutch person, very individualistic, and then looking at that, you may risk exaggerating how smoothly everything works there, and that it doesn't mean that there isn't conflict and it isn't a challenge for people at times. So anyway, in terms of borderline personality, well, I think there's a general issue here, which is that, first of all, we don't understand these things all that well. So we shouldn't pretend that just because we put a name on it, now we understand everything that's going on. And a lot of the current approaches to something like borderline personality try to unpack it and say we're dealing with certain extreme temperamental traits and certain kind of life adversity and certain kind of coping strategy. And those things all converge to create the syndrome we call borderline personality.